Well, I want to welcome you back to the second in our series of case studies, where we look at New Testament ministry, beginning with the life of Jesus, extending into the Acts and the epistles and future case studies. But today, as we did last time, we're looking at the matter of entry, how Jesus and his disciples were led in the midst of their itinerants to engage empty fields across Galilee. Now, as it was in the book of Mark, Jesus constantly moving among the crowds and the few, the crowds and the few. If we look into Matthew, we see something consistent. Even in Matthew 9:35, it says that Jesus went through all the towns and villages of Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and healing the sick. Matthew 9, it says he saw the crowds. They were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And then in chapter 10, we see him choosing the 12, putting them in groups 2 by 2, and sending them out to join with him, not just in his itinerance, but in the engagement of these same empty fields. And in Mark and Matthew. But today our case study is going to come along the same lines, along the same unfolding of itinerant mission, disciple making, from the Gospel of Luke. Now, the Gospel of Luke really does center on itinerance. Just as we said from Mark last time, if we were to look into chapter 8 of the Gospel of Luke, we'd see that. Verse number 1, after the healing of the sinful woman, after this, Jesus traveled about from town to town and one village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12, it says in verse number 1, were with him. Across the Gospel of Luke, we can see it over and over. We see examples of Jesus preaching and engaging the crowds in synagogues. We see him in a boat out on the lake, preaching to those along the shore. We see him in open spaces, giving Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. But we also see over and over again, as Jesus relates to the crowds, him retreating, him concentrating his time on these 12, even as he pioneers in new cities in house to house among those he would engage. So in chapter 4, he's in Simon Peter's house, even as we read in Mark 1, Simon Peter's mother-in-law's home. In chapter 5, he's there at the tax collector Levi's home. They're eating with sinners and tax collectors. In chapter number 7, he's on his way toward the house of the centurion when a miracle occurs and makes the visit to the house no longer necessary. In the same chapter 7, we see him in a Pharisee's home, being questioned and defending his own posture and his own identity. In chapter number 8, one town and village to another, just as we read. But even in the same chapter, in chapter 8, we see that as Jesus' mother and brothers came to him, he was told that they are waiting outside. Evidently, he'd been doing and ministering, teaching from house to house, consistently in these early days with the disciples. And that brings us, in the pattern of Jesus engaging empty fields, to the sending of the 12 in Luke chapter 9, to the sending of the 70 others in Luke chapter 10. And it seems that there across Galilee, consistent with his earthly ministry, his intention to travel throughout all the towns and villages of Galilee, early on in 9 and 10, he's mobilizing those same 12. He's giving responsibility to the 12 to take up and carry on the same ministry, the same message that he himself had modeled for them in the first 8 chapters. So in chapter 9, 2 by 2, the 12 are sent out. Ahead of him in chapter 10, the 70 others, understand this, 35 sets of 2 were organized, and in Luke chapter 10, verse 1, he sent them ahead of him to every town and place he himself was about to go. As we think about engaging empty fields, we could recognize as part of Jesus' entry strategy, not just for the sake of sharing the good news of the kingdom, seed sowing, but also in disciple making, mobilizing even leaders, the 12 and the 70 who might go and take up the ministry with him. Now, Luke chapter 10, verse 2 is amazing for us. Even as Jesus is about to instruct them how to go about the work in that context there in the first century, but verse number 2 begins the work. And Jesus says to the 70 others, In verse number 2 of Luke 10, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field. And so we might conclude that the first part of that work, the first part of laboring in the kingdom, is the expression of dependence on the Lord of the harvest. That those who were the harvest force, 35 sets of two, those who were being sent to engage the harvest field, all the towns and villages of Galilee, all those villages Jesus himself was about to go, the first aspect of their work is the recognition and expression of dependence on the Lord of the harvest, who would raise up, even multiply laborers. I'm shocked by this notion. It's Eckhard Schnabel, some others who, through archaeology, have told us that most likely 170 towns and villages of Galilee. If you have 35 sets of laborers, 35 sets of two, to be sent out, why not just simply do the work? Why not simply engage and sow the seed, make disciples? And of course, we're going to see them employed in that mission. And yet, Jesus reminds them from the very beginning, surely they know, you simply aren't enough. The very dependence on the Lord of the harvest, the prayer for additional laborers, as the first aspect of work, is a confession. Why did 35 not just do the work? And the first acknowledgement that 35 sets of two simply aren't enough to engage the field that Jesus had envisioned. They had, as their first order of work, to acknowledge their dependence and the reality that the harvest forced must be multiplied. When we think about our time on the field, when we think about our time invested in mission, we often over years of time have had the chance to welcome new team members, other cross-cultural workers coming and going from the west into the east. And so very often we see that same assumption that lives in our heart, that our calling, our gifting, our calendar might be the plan. Even as we are the sent ones, they're going about the work of mission, discovering the missionary task as the Lord of the harvest leads. And this truth that has to take root in my heart, that we ourselves are not the plan, that your calendar, even dare I say your gifting, is not the plan of the kingdom. Ultimately, it's the willingness to die, the willingness to give away, the willingness to step aside, even to mobilize and anticipate, to pray for and to equip a multiplying harvest force that might engage the harvest fields of the world. The will of the Lord of the harvest. As you consider this case study, how to enter empty fields, are you able to look past yourself? You're not the strategy. The Lord's got his plans. Perhaps through your disciples, as we move forward, we'll continue to see that plan unfold. Until that time, I simply say God bless you.